I never imagined that at 71, I would be sitting on a cold kitchen floor, staring at my own blood, wondering when exactly my life had turned into something so disposable. Not in a stranger's home, not in a hospital corridor, but inside my own son's house, the same walls I once helped pay for, the same roof I believed would always shelter me. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet winter morning where snow falls softly, pretending the world is peaceful. I had woken up early like I always do, careful not to disturb anyone. Old habits don't disappear just because you grow older. I made myself smaller over the years, quieter footsteps, softer words, fewer opinions, because that was easier for everyone else. Bradley and his wife, Juliana, had been tense all morning. I felt it before a word was spoken. There's a certain heaviness in the air when you're no longer welcome but no one has the courage to say it out loud. Juliana stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, her eyes sharp but her voice dangerously calm. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" she asked. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words were precise, cutting straight through me. I looked toward Bradley, my son, hoping foolishly that he would meet my eyes, that he would say something. Anything. He didn't. He stood there scrolling on his phone, pretending the conversation had nothing to do with him. But it had everything to do with him. That house still had my name on it and they didn't like that. Not anymore. I told them I wasn't ready, that maybe we could talk later. After dinner. When things were calmer. I said it gently, the way mothers do when they're trying not to upset grown children who no longer remember what sacrifice looks like. Juliana stepped closer. She said I needed some fresh air. That I was being emotional. That it would be better if I stepped outside for a moment. Her hand grabbed my arm. First it wasn't painful. Just firm. Then something shifted. Bradley moved beside her. I remember the tension in his jaw. I remember his hand brushing mine. Not to protect me, but to guide me. The next second my back hit glass. There was a sharp crack, loud and final, like something breaking that could never be fixed. The door shattered beneath me. I fell backward into the snow, into the cold, into broken glass. My coat tore. My hands burned. Blood spread across the white ground, bright and undeniable. From inside the house, I heard Juliana's voice say it was an accident. That I lost my balance. That they were trying to help. But they didn't open the door. They didn't come outside. Not even my son. I stood there shaking, not from the cold but from something much deeper. Something quiet snapped inside me. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. They wanted me gone. And in that moment, as the snow soaked into my shoes and blood dripped from my hand, I realized something they never expected. I was done being invisible. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I wasn't the powerless, penniless old woman they believed me to be. And that silence they left me in? That silence was only the beginning. I don't remember how long I stood outside in the snow after that door shattered behind me, but I remember the silence more than anything else. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the realization that no one was coming. No footsteps rushing toward me. No voice calling my name. No door opening with regret. I picked myself up slowly, every movement reminding me how fragile they thought I was and how wrong they truly were. I wrapped my bleeding hand in the edge of my scarf and began walking down the driveway, each step heavier than the last. Not because of pain but because memories flooded my mind with every breath. I remembered holding Bradley's hand when he took his first steps, staying up all night when he had fevers, skipping meals so he could have better shoes for school. I remembered defending him when teachers doubted him, standing beside him when his father left us, choosing him over everything else life could have offered me. And now here I was, discarded like a broken chair that no longer matched their decor. I didn't cry as I walked. Tears would have meant they still had power over me. Instead, I felt something colder and steadier settle into my chest. A resolve I hadn't felt in decades. By the time I reached the bus stop at the corner, my hand had stopped bleeding, but my heart had started hardening in ways I never thought possible. I sat there, staring at the road, replaying Juliana's calm cruelty and Bradley's silence over and over until it finally became clear. This wasn't a mistake and it wasn't sudden. This had been building for years, hidden behind forced smiles and polite dinners. They hadn't pushed me through that door out of anger. They had done it because to them I was already gone. And as the bus headlights appeared in the distance, I made myself a promise I would never break. If they wanted me erased from their lives, then they would never get the version of me that kept sacrificing, forgiving, and staying quiet ever again. The bus ride felt endless, not because of the distance, but because every passing streetlight illuminated another memory I had spent years trying to ignore. I watched the city blur past the fogged-up window and realized how much of my life I had quietly folded away to make space for my son's comfort. I remembered the day Bradley brought Juliana home for the first time. How I stood in the kitchen rehearsing what to say so I wouldn't embarrass him. How I smiled even when she barely looked at me. How I convinced myself that her coldness was just nerves. Over the years I learned to shrink in my own home. Speaking softer, moving slower, asking permission for things that once belonged to me. When they married, I gave them my savings to help with the down payment, telling myself money could always be earned again but family couldn't. When Juliana suggested I move into the guest room because the master bedroom needed more space, I agreed. When Bradley stopped calling me mom and started calling me by my first name in front of her, I swallowed the sting. And when they joked about me being fragile or old-fashioned, I laughed along, afraid that speaking up would make me a burden in their eyes. Sitting on that bus, I finally saw the pattern with painful clarity. Every compromise I made taught them how little resistance I would offer. By the time the glass shattered behind me, I had already been breaking quietly for years. The bus stopped at a small terminal near the edge of town, and as I stepped off into the cold night air, something inside me shifted. I wasn't homeless, I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't finished. I still had my mind, my memories, and a truth they never cared to ask about. The truth that everything they had built, every comfort they enjoyed, rested on sacrifices I had made without ever demanding credit. As I walked toward a dimly lit motel across the street, clutching my purse like an anchor, I understood something that scared me and strengthened me at the same time. The woman they thought they had erased was about to remember exactly who she was, and once she did, there would be no way back to the silence they depended on. That motel room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpets, but to me it felt safer than the house I had been thrown out of only hours earlier. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, my coat still on, my hands resting in my lap as if I were afraid to touch anything and be reminded that this wasn't home, or maybe that it was. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of broken glass, heard Juliana's sharp intake of breath, and Bradley's voice raised not in shock or regret, but in irritation, as if I had inconvenienced them by bleeding on their floor. Sometime after midnight I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos, pictures I hadn't looked at in years. Bradley as a toddler with a scraped knee, Bradley on his first bike, Bradley smiling at me with that open trust children give so freely before the world teaches them otherwise. I wondered when that boy had turned into a man who could watch his mother be thrown aside and feel justified. The question hurt, but it also hardened something inside me. I realized that the story I had been telling myself, that keeping the peace was love, that silence was strength, had cost me my dignity. In the quiet hum of that room I began to remember things I had deliberately forgotten. The legal papers I had signed years ago when my husband passed, the accounts Bradley didn't know about, the house deed that had never been transferred, the quiet decisions I had made to protect my future while pretending I had none. I hadn't planned revenge, not consciously, but I had planned survival. By morning, as pale light crept through the thin curtains, I felt steadier, clearer. I washed my face in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Older, yes, bruised, absolutely, but also awake in a way she hadn't been for decades. I wasn't going back to beg, and I wasn't going back to explain. For the first time, my next steps wouldn't be shaped by fear of losing my son's approval. They would be shaped by truth, and that truth was simple. I had been underestimated for far too long, and the people who believed they had broken me were about to learn how dangerous a woman can be when she finally stops asking for permission to exist. By late morning, I was sitting in a quiet cafe a few blocks away from the motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business, and for the first time since the night before, my hands had stopped shaking. I wrapped them around a warm cup of coffee and let myself think clearly, not as a wounded mother or a discarded inconvenience, but as a woman who had lived long enough to understand leverage. I made 3 phone calls that morning, none of them emotional, none of them impulsive. The first was to a lawyer I had once helped through a difficult time years ago, back when favors were exchanged quietly and remembered carefully. The second was to the bank, where my name still carried weight Bradley never knew existed. And the third was one I hesitated over the longest, not because of fear, but because it marked the point of no return. I left a calm, measured message for Bradley, not accusing, not crying, simply stating that I would be unavailable for the foreseeable future, and that any further communication should go through legal channels. When I hung up, I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally untied. As the day passed, pieces began to fall into place, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. Documents pulled, accounts reviewed, truths resurfacing that had been buried under years of family harmony. I realized then how carefully I had been managed, how often my generosity had been mistaken for weakness, how easily my silence had been rewritten as consent. Yet what struck me most was not anger but clarity. I saw how Juliana's confidence was built on assumptions, how Bradley's cruelty was supported by the belief that I would never push back, and how fragile their sense of control actually was. That evening, back in the motel room, I laid out papers across the small table like a map, not of revenge, but of reclamation. I wasn't planning to destroy them, I was planning to step out of their narrative entirely, and in doing so remove the foundation they stood on. The glass door they had thrown me through had cut my skin, yes, but it had also shattered the illusion that love required endurance without limits. And as I folded those papers carefully and packed them into my bag, I knew that the next time Bradley saw me, it would not be as the woman he had discarded, but as someone he no longer recognized, someone who had quietly taken her power back while he was still congratulating himself on having one. The following days unfolded with a strange calm that felt almost unreal, as if the storm had already passed and what remained was the quiet reckoning afterward. I moved slowly, deliberately, choosing each step with care, because I had learned the hard way that rushing only benefits those who underestimate you. From the motel, I relocated to a small furnished apartment near the edge of town, paid for in advance, no forwarding address, no explanations offered. I watched from a distance as the world Bradley and Juliana believed they controlled began to show small, invisible cracks. The first sign came when Bradley called again, this time not angry, not dismissive, but confused. His voice carried an edge of uncertainty I had never heard before, as though he were speaking to someone whose rules he no longer understood. I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, can be louder than confrontation. A day later, the lawyer reached out, confirming what I already suspected. Assets I had contributed over decades, quietly and without ceremony, were still legally tied to my name. Accounts Bradley assumed were untouchable required my authorization. Decisions he thought were final were, in truth, only provisional. Meanwhile, Juliana's behavior shifted in ways that were almost predictable. Where she had once paraded confidence, there was now irritation, sharpness, a restless energy that betrayed anxiety. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was making calls, asking questions she had never thought to ask before, trying to understand systems she had assumed would always bend in her favor. Watching this unfold did not fill me with satisfaction the way I once imagined revenge might. Instead, it filled me with a quiet sense of balance being restored. I spent my mornings walking through a nearby park, letting my thoughts settle, letting my body recover from the bruises and the deeper wounds no one could see. I remembered every compromise I had made over the years, the holidays rearranged for their convenience, the opinions swallowed to keep peace, the money given without acknowledgement, and for the first time I did not frame those memories as failures. They were investments, and like all investments they had matured. One afternoon, an official-looking envelope arrived at my new address, forwarded discreetly through channels Bradley never knew existed. Inside were confirmations, signatures, timelines. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic. Just undeniable reality printed in black ink. That night I sat alone at the small dining table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries being enforced for the first time. Bradley's next message reflected that shift completely. Gone was entitlement. Gone was certainty. Instead, there was negotiation, thinly disguised as concern. He asked where I was staying. He asked when we could talk. He asked if there had been a misunderstanding. I read the message once and set the phone down without replying. Misunderstandings are accidents. This had been a pattern. As the days passed, word reached me that tensions were rising in their home. Arguments erupting over money, over plans suddenly postponed, over expectations no longer guaranteed. Juliana, I heard, blamed Bradley. Bradley blamed stress. Neither blamed themselves. And that, I realized, was the difference between us. I had already taken responsibility for my own silence, my own endurance, my own awakening. On the sixth night after I left, I stood by the apartment window watching city lights flicker like distant stars and understood something with absolute clarity. They had not lost control because I fought them. They had lost control because I stepped away. The absence of my compliance exposed the fragility of their power. The woman they believed they could push through a glass door and forget had quietly restructured the ground beneath their feet. And though the final confrontation had yet to come, I knew without doubt that when it did, I would not need to raise my voice, justify my pain, or demand respect. The consequences were already moving toward them, steady and unavoidable, and all I had to do was remain exactly where I was, firm, silent, and no longer afraid. The confrontation did not happen the way I once imagined it would, with shouting or accusations or dramatic ultimatums. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, as if even the truth itself was tired of being delayed. Bradley finally showed up at my apartment one late afternoon, unannounced, standing outside the door longer than necessary before knocking, his posture stiff, his confidence carefully rehearsed but already cracking at the edges. When I opened the door, his eyes widened just slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of seeing me composed, steady, unharmed by the chaos he believed he had unleashed. Juliana stood a step behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression guarded, lips pressed thin as though holding back words she wasn't sure would still work. I invited them in without warmth and without hostility, simply stepping aside and letting the silence do the heavy lifting. We sat across from each other at the small table, the same one where I had first read the official documents days earlier, and for a moment no one spoke. Bradley broke first, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, layered with forced concern. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I understood how stressful things had become for everyone. I listened without interrupting, noting how every sentence circled back to inconvenience. His inconvenience, their inconvenience, never once touching the reality of what had been done to me. Juliana eventually joined in, her tone sharper, defensive, accusing without using the word. She said things had gotten out of hand, that emotions were high, that families sometimes say things they don't mean. I watched her carefully as she spoke, the flicker of fear beneath her irritation revealing itself whenever Bradley glanced her way. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle, which seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. I told them there had been no misunderstanding. I told them I remembered every word, every shove, every look that had stripped me of dignity in my own home. I told them that what hurt most wasn't the glass door or the pain in my body, but the certainty in their voices when they decided I no longer mattered. Bradley tried to interrupt, his hand lifting slightly, a reflex from years of control, but I didn't stop speaking. I told them I had spent decades building a life that supported theirs, emotionally and financially, and that stepping away had shown me something essential. My absence revealed their dependence. Juliana's composure finally cracked then, her voice rising as she accused me of overreacting, of trying to punish them, of turning a family issue into a legal disaster. That was when Bradley snapped at her, sharp and sudden, blaming her for pushing too far, for saying things she shouldn't have said, for escalating a situation he believed he could still manage. The argument between them unfolded right in front of me, raw and unfiltered, years of unspoken resentment spilling out in accusations about money, control, expectations, and entitlement. I sat there silently, not as a victim, but as a witness, realizing that the fracture between them had existed long before I ever left. When the noise finally subsided, I told them exactly what would happen next. I explained the boundaries clearly, without threats, without drama. Communication would go through lawyers. Decisions involving my assets would require my consent. Access to my time, my home, my care would no longer be assumed. Bradley stared at the table, his jaw tight, while Juliana's eyes darted around the room as though searching for leverage that no longer existed. Before they left, Bradley asked one final question, his voice barely above a whisper, if there was any way to fix this. I met his gaze and told him the truth. Fixing requires accountability, not apologies, and accountability is something no one can fake. They left without another word, the door closing softly behind them, and in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not revenge, but relief. The weight I had carried for so long was finally gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms, no longer invisible, no longer powerless, and never again willing to be broken for someone else's comfort. In the weeks that followed, life did not suddenly become easy, but it became honest, and that made all the difference. The quiet of my apartment no longer felt lonely, it felt earned. Every morning I woke up without the knot of dread that used to sit in my chest, without waiting for a phone call that would demand something from me, without bracing myself for disappointment disguised as family. I began rebuilding my routine slowly. Walks in the early morning when the streets were still empty, afternoons spent reading by the window, evenings filled with music I liked instead of conversations that drained me. The legal matters moved forward methodically, not with vengeance but with clarity. Each document signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been handed away out of love and never returned. Friends I had neglected over the years reached out, some apologetic for not noticing sooner, others simply grateful I was still there. I let them in at my own pace, learning that support does not have to come with conditions. Bradley tried to call once, then twice, leaving messages that sounded rehearsed, full of regret but light on responsibility. I listened to them only once, not out of hope but out of closure, and then I let the silence return. I realized that forgiveness for me did not mean reconciliation. It meant releasing the expectation that he would ever become the son I once imagined. Juliana never reached out again, and strangely, that felt like confirmation rather than loss. The physical scars faded quicker than the emotional ones, but even those began to soften as I stopped reliving the past and started designing a future that belonged to me. I volunteered at a local community center not because I needed to be needed but because I wanted to be present, to give without disappearing. I learned how to say no without explaining myself and yes without guilt. On Christmas morning, I set the table for one, not in sadness, but in peace, lighting a candle and cooking a meal that tasted better than any feast I had prepared under obligation. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who believed endurance was the same as love, and I felt compassion instead of shame. Strength, I learned, is not loud, and dignity does not demand recognition. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is step away and choose themselves after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. I don't know what the future holds, and for the first time, I'm not afraid of that uncertainty. My life is quieter now, smaller in some ways, but infinitely more mine. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this: you are never too old, too broken, or too late to reclaim your worth. The door that closed behind them did not shut me out, it finally opened the path home.